So, welcome to the latest episode of the Circular Table Talks, brought to you by We Don't Have Time and Ragn-Sells, the European Environment Company. We're proud to say that these talks are now actually in their third year, and we've covered many topics in the past. We've covered everything from new innovations to harvest valuable materials like phosphorus and nitrogen out of our wastewater, up to how to put a proper price on carbon in a way that might actually stimulate the harvesting and the reuse of the key climate change gas, carbon dioxide. Today, we're going to zone in on a challenge, but also the opportunity for transforming the use of materials in the construction sector and the building sector. From those produced to make buildings and infrastructure, often with a high energy cost and a heavy environmental footprint, up to those generated by the renovation and the demolition of structures. According to the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is hosted by the UN Environment Programme, it says in its 22 Global Status Report that buildings and construction sector accounted for around 37% of energy and process-related carbon dioxide emissions and over 34% of energy demand globally. There are lots of numbers in many reports like this, but I think the overall conclusion of the UN Environment Programme hosted Alliance is that the buildings and the construction sector is simply not on track to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement to decarbonise and achieve net zero by 2050. And their reports also point out that the actual climate performance of the sector as a whole and the decarbonisation pathways to net zero are not narrowing, they're actually widening. I was also a bit taken by a recent assessment by the consultant Roland Berger, who found that in respect to demolition waste alone, when buildings reach the end of their lifetime, only 40% of construction waste is recycled or reused in the European Union. And even worse, you might say, most of these recycled materials are downcycled for second-grade construction purposes like roads, rather than upcycled into new green reusable materials for green buildings. Around the world, including in Europe, policymakers and experts are aware of the challenges here and also, to an extent, the opportunities. The new circular economy approach of the EU notes the importance of addressing this challenge. And even as long ago as 2008, the Waste Framework Directive set an aim to have 70% of construction and demolition waste recycled by 2020. The importance here is that with the vast majority of construction of buildings set to occur in developing countries, leadership, innovation and action in Europe may prove crucial for providing answers at home, but also abroad. But that big step needs to happen now. So today with Ragn-Sells, we're saying enough is enough and the time to act is now. And just before we get underway for this terrifically important broadcast, let me ask the viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org. And you can basically interact with the guests on this show, interact with the wider family that is We Don't Have Time. Let me first introduce Eli Jacobsen. Eli is the head of innovation management at the Ragn-Sells group, and he has spent 20 years in the United Nations, in academia, in the private and public sectors, mainly providing proactive environmental strategies. Eli, I threw out a few figures there in my opening remarks. There are many more, but I also referred to the huge opportunities, including a big help in the fight against climate change, more good green jobs perhaps, and sizable economic benefits, if we can just get this right. So tell me what you're thinking in terms of what you're planning to do with this sector at Ragn-Sells to try and get it on a faster and more impactful circular wheel, you might say. And my last point I'd ask you is this really a big shout out for everybody that cares to really join forces with their creativity and their visions on this big challenge?
Well, thank you, Nick, for hosting us today and for raising up to discussion this important topic, which is extremely necessary to further contribute to circular economy. First of all, in this regard of those verified numbers you mentioned coming from United Nations Global Status Report for 2022 about the building and construction sector, let us, before discussing the effects of those on our future, convey to the viewers and all of us agree on very simple facts. One, depleting our virgin and natural resources is taking place in a large scale. Two, the unsustainable consumption pattern of today is almost out of control. And three, climate change is in the central point of all actions, and everybody has a commitment to reduce the CO2 emissions. From another angle, circularity can face those challenges, and many are not doing enough to increase this rate. The recent circular economy report has shown a decrease from 8.9% to 7.4, even though we have an increase in quantity, but surely we need a change in terms and conditions of the processing. Two, as mentioned by you clearly, innovation can accelerate this change and contribute to circular, sustainable, and resource-efficient solutions. Three, building and construction sector, which we are focusing on today, has simply the largest quantity of resources which need immediate zoom in to benefit from. You have more available resources compared with food and textiles. Therefore, Nick, the viewers will be able to know more about the innovation interventions, examples where your guests today, as Ragn-Sells colleagues and other stakeholders, will explain further within a proactive environmental strategy, a preventive win-win approach with environmental and economical dimensions, but also with a social perspective and high ethical standards. I think, Nick, it's necessary to start working on a cultural change within the construction sector. So we think more in terms of a combined and integrated process instead of individual parts. It's already on the way for the building itself, but far away with the relation about for the thoughts for building area and surroundings. This transformations is for the benefit of people and earth. So let's us start with this innovation wave.
Okay, great, Eli, and thank you. I mean, this is, as you say, a very important topic, and I even read just the other day that apparently 100 years ago in most rich countries, nearly all these materials were actually reused. So we seem to have gone on a very strange path in the last 100 years, not just on this, but on many of these environmental challenges. Per Larsens, my wonderful co-host, no show of the Circular Table Talks would be complete without Per. And Per, you're co-chair of a working group on the circular economy under the International Chamber of Commerce and Director of Sustainability at Ragn-Sells Group. So Per, briefly, you're going to come in and out of the show and with your perspectives, but just give us a launch perspective on this from where you're coming on. Because this is not just going to be a single show, is it? We're going to be addressing this over the next months right up to the end of the year.
Yes, Nick, and I remember the show we had February last year, and that was about plastics. And the conclusion with the UN delegate was that the more recycling will not solve the problem. We need to change how we produce the plastics. And I think in the same way, you said it very clearly, Nick, that we are reusing the material over and over again. So we need to change how we produce our material. So I think that is a key component. But today's legislation are saying minimize the waste. I would like to have it to maximize the return of resources, make sure that we enable the resources to be used. And clearly that is also the fact when it comes to the circular economy gap report from 2022. There is a reduction in percentage of how circular the world are. We're not recycling less. It's very important to understand that. We're recycling the same thing as we've done before, but we are putting more digging up more things from under the ground to be used. And so we need to change how we are producing things. So I really would like to see this show and come in the end and comment. And I really like to hear the perspective from the designers and, of course, what's possible to reuse or other ways to make sure that we can bring back resources in a good way. So looking forward to listen to the experts.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Per. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the diggers and the cement mixers have now fallen silent, and the Circular Table Talks is set to introduce the first of our special guests for a deeper glimpse into this issue. And first up, we're very pleased to have And I'm English, right? So I'm going to try really hard to pronounce your names properly. I tried to check it this morning. But first up is Ditte Lysgaard Vint. Okay, if that's really terrible, then you have to come back to me immediately. Who is a Danish expert and author on circularity in materials as it relates to buildings and design. Ditte is chairwoman of the Danish Design Council, a partner of the firm Lysgaard, a board member of the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts School of Architecture, Design and Conservation, and the Danish Green Building Council. And there's a lot more titles too, but I'll stop it there. Ditte, how is Europe doing in embracing circularity in the building and construction sector? Are you optimistic we can scale this and reverse some of the less than sparkling numbers that we heard earlier? Over to you, Ditte.
That is a very good question. So by default, I'm a stubborn optimist. So yes, it is most certainly possible, especially when combining circular economy and design to really deliver not just doing less bad within existing structures, but really reimagining the system and shaping a new future. However, that said, while we have talked about circular economy and the theoretical potentials within the built environment for a very, very long time, we're still very much lacking actually seeing them in absolute sustainability terms. So we're still, the built environment is still way too much of a problem and way too little a part of the solution. But I do see cracks of light coming through from the European Union, in particular with the legislation. I think the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance is really driving change within the built environment, because it's something that the developers are really looking towards and guided by. Secondly, the new industrial package for green development is really creating the incentives for new green solutions coming forward. And then lastly, I think the really interesting part from the European Union is that the Bauhaus movement, so saying this is not going to be technology only, this is also going to be culture, creativity, design and architecture that are going to provide solutions, and that's going to be a key competitive edge that Europe can bring forward and help create solutions for the rest of the world. So I think that's really something that makes me positive that within circular economy, and as Per was touching upon, that's about reducing the amount of square meters, for instance, that we need and built in the future, but also about reusing more and then finding these better ways of doing the high quality recycling. So it's not just large quantities, but it's really figuring out how can we create symbiosis, etc., within the built environment and new partnerships so that the reuses stay in circulations, even though it might be in different organizations or in different parts of the value chain.
Just to clear one thing up, when you mentioned the Bauhaus movement, of course, there was the famous Bauhaus that was created in Germany during the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, yeah, with their amazing designs. Is this an inspiration that has now been passed on into a new movement, in a sense?
Yeah, exactly. So Ursula von Leyen, the chairwoman of the Commission, she's put forward this new European Bauhaus movement of really saying, how can we use creativity to re-spark the European economy and really have architecture and design at the core, which I think, as Bauhaus provides a great example for, but also the Danish design heritage, where we really see that having a social purpose provided a positive creative constraint. And I think today we can see the same with the planetary boundaries that we know we have to stay within, rather than having that as something that lessens the final solutions, makes it more ugly, more expensive, etc. It can be something that heightens the overall ambitions and create better results. But it takes creativity.
Yeah, good. Super, Ditte. Stay with us for the second half, where we're going to have a real conversation about this. Now, let me turn to Camilla Sonnentheil, Head of Business Development at Ragn-Sells in Sweden. Camilla, let's home in on one material, okay? Glass, or more particularly flat glass. What is happening here that might be some cause for confidence in respect to at least this one key building material?
Yes, I would like to talk about a very positive thing about this new solution. here in Scandinavia anyway. Flat glass is the same as the glass in windows and in the car glass, for example. That's flat glass. We work in an innovation here now to recycle flat glass. So there are mainly two reasons why it's important to use recycled flat glass in production of new flat glass. The virgin raw material to produce flat glass is sand, but however, the specific sand that's needed, there's a limited amount left of that specific sand to produce a new flat glass. So estimates tell us that the sand will only last for another maybe 50 years or so, and that's a pretty short time. Another thing is that the CO2 reductions when using recycled flat glass is about 54% compared to using the virgin raw material sand. Among other things, the energy consumption is 30% lower when using recycled flat glass than when you use sand. So it has a big impact on the climate. Today, most of the flat glass waste in Sweden goes to landfill. RISE, Research Institute of Sweden, estimates that some 10 to 20,000 tons of flat glass each year go to landfill in Sweden. That's quite a lot. But Saint-Gobain, which is our partner in this innovation project, they even think the number is higher, some 35,000 tons per year. But anyway, it's difficult to estimate how much of those volumes actually would be possible to recycle, but we're calculating that about 80% is a fair amount. So we're talking huge volumes here, a lot of savings in the carbon dioxide. So
Interesting.
Except for landfill, some volumes are being used for producing new glass packaging. One could argue that that's good, and of course it's better than landfill, but you still need the virgin raw material sand for producing new flat glass, so it doesn't really help that much. So we need to keep the flat glass in the flat glass loop, so to speak. But so far, no volumes in Sweden have gone to the production yet of new flat glass. And one of the reasons for that is that the very high quality demands. The glass must be very, very clean. And the allowed level of contamination is in principle 0. So it's all about how to handle the glass through the whole process. But change is on the way. Yep. We will have in our innovation project for a circular solution of flat glass, we are developing this process where we take care of the flat glass waste and treat it so it becomes a new raw material that can be used in the production of new flat glass. And right now we're in the test phase, but we plan to have everything up and running after this summer.
Good. Camilla, thank you for that. And so there is a chink of light. Ditte was talking about chinks of light coming through. Here's another chink of light, which is probably quite appropriate for glass, I suppose. I suppose the fact is that when these, this flat glass, right, you think of some of the huge buildings in the last like 20 odd years that have been constructed with, flat glass, massive structures. And so the moment is coming at some time, not so far from now in the history of the planet, that all this is going to be demolished and restructured, and there's going to be a lot of waste flat glass around. So your innovation could actually be very timely for what's happening with landscapes, etc.
Yes.
So stay with us, Camilla. This is very interesting. And let's now go to our next guest. So our third guest is Nicholas Nolsø. He is Business Development Director at the Danish architectural company Lysgaard. He's here sitting next to Ditte, so the audience can see that there is some connection here. He is an architect from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen and a construction architect from the Copenhagen School of Technology. You've been involved, Nicholas, in several pioneering projects, including TRAE in Aarhus, Denmark, a 3-story wooden structure with innovative design and high use of recycled, reused materials. Many others I read on the website. Look, give us a glimpse into a project that you might have been associated with, or one that you think is absolutely fantastically interesting, which you might not have been associated with. It doesn't really matter. But maybe explain to us how high levels of circularity were achieved in these projects. What was special that came together in a sense? I think that's what would be interesting to hear. Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation to join this session here. So I really admire the positive mindset that everybody wants to bring into this discussion, because I think it's really important that we keep hope in general for working towards a more sustainable and circular future. For the time being, I'm very focused on actually expanding our entire knowledge generally, so we not just rely on specialists, this group being the ones to tell people what to do, but more like getting a broader understanding of possibilities and options. In that sense that, for instance, talking about the glass, I really believe that one of the dogmas we work a lot with here in Lysgaard is that we need to find a way to reuse or repurpose a material at the lowest cost possible. So going down to shredding and remelting glass, that's a solution that's doable. But is there a solution that has a higher value with doing less work, if you know what I mean? So I'm really interested in trying to take this knowledge and inspire people and inspire to go and do more and go and explore more. So when Ditte talks about our heritage, I also think it's important that we understand the history. Why are we here? And then understand that buildings is something we've done the entire time that humans has been on this earth. But for the last 70 years, we've gone global with how we build. If we went before the 19th century, a building culture was very based in the local region. What is the material? What is the environment we try to protect from? All of these things. And then all of a sudden, after the World War II, we started to implement the same way of doing everything everywhere. So if we need to be more circular, we need to be more local again. We need to look at what are the resources available, and then we need to look at how can we process them. And all of this knowledge is actually is represented in all these local regions mostly. So an example of how to directly reuse, I would like to continue Camilla's working within Windows. We have taken reused glass and made a new facade out of that with 20-year-old insulated glass units. So from production, you produce an insulated glass unit consisting of 2 glass panes, and then there's a vacuum gap in between. And then you put it on a building, and then we say it can last for 50 years. But what we see is that they are normally taken down a lot earlier than 50 years. These windows we got a hold on, they were 20 years old. And we think in this company that this is not the solution. But instead of looking at why we were changing those windows, we thought, let's find a solution for the old windows. And then we look back in history and understand what we have done in the past. And in the past, we took when the first energy crisis hit, we took 1 layer of glass and then we added an extra layer of glass. So we thought, okay, so can we do that again? And then we built a new window frame with 2 layers of 2 layers glass. So it's just an example of trying not to break the window, but to say, can we use this? Can we use whatever qualities this window has, and then work with it and do a minimum amount of work to it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, and I think that's probably a kind of discussion almost within its own. It's like almost a separate show, right? Because it's a part. There's such a big jigsaw puzzle here. I know that we are just skimming the surface in this first episode to try and get the audience, the viewers, millions of people out there that will watch this show to just engage on this in terms of thinking and how they deal with policymakers and what do they do about this. But I love the idea of this cultural reference, right? I mean, the challenge we have, of course, is that, and we do this with food, shop local, buy local, blah, 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 except at the same time, there's this huge mammoth thing out there called globalization and supply chains crisscrossing across, continents. How one balances these two equations that are the reality of the modern world, in respect to materials and construction and buildings is interesting too. But I think you're right with the buildings and their locales. I mean, I always remember the tsunami in 2005 in Banda Aceh in Indonesia. Some of the few buildings that were standing after that were mosques because they had open structures and the water could go straight through. I mean, there's many, many stories like that. But stay with us, Nicholas. I think it's a very, very interesting area indeed. Very, very, very interesting. Last but not least, we have Linnéa Sellberg. She's section manager, clean construction at Ragn-Sells Recycling. And she's also very committed to gender equality in her company, which is a very important topic in this. I'm sure we won't be able to cover it today, but it's worth noting. Linnéa, Ragn-Sells is working on a project with a company called Econo. Can you tell us a little bit about this and how it could be a blueprint for boosting recycling rates, achieving more in terms of the circular economy in Sweden, but perhaps in Europe more broadly?
So at Rent Bygge, or clean construction, as we say in English, we have people at the construction site, and the person who's there can help the building project with the waste problem. So they make sure there are always bins in the right spot and take the bins out and usually empty them into bigger containers and put the empty bins back so that there's always somewhere for the workers to throw their waste. And because we're there all the time, there's always somebody for the construction workers to ask when they don't know how to sort something. And this is one of the big benefits with having Rent Bygge or clean construction. We can help we have seen at Econo, for example, or other projects that they increase their recycling rates because they know how to sort the waste when there's somebody there and they don't have to pick up the phone and chase somebody down to figure out how to sort their waste. So that's one of the big benefits. We also make sure that to order the collection of the containers or the bins at the right times to minimize transport and always make sure that there are containers they can put their waste in. And that's the main concept. We take care of the waste, we order the shifting of containers, we are there as a consultant basically for anything waste related. We also take part in the planning meetings to help figure out if there's a need to adapt the amount of containers or the fractions that we sort depending on what comes out in the next phase of the project. I talked to one of the project managers at Econo just earlier today to see what the main benefits that they see in clean constructions, and they took up the recycling rates as one of the major things, but also because at their project we have a person in the machine, and when he is not busy handling the waste, we can also help with unloading building materials and taking them out to the right spot at the project to help make sure they have their material ready when they need it. And if we don't have anything else to do, we can also help with clearing snow, sanding the area. We basically provide a person that can do whatever is needed in the project, but of course, focusing on the waste first. So that is another big benefit.
Okay, so basically the waste company, the environmental management company, yourselves are working directly with the construction workers and the customer, as it were, to make sure that demolition materials go into the right buckets, as it were, and then goes properly to be recycled rather than getting sort of heavily contaminated with all kinds of stuff. It makes it easier and it makes it more possible to recycle more. And that's nice. I like the idea. We often talk about digitalization, and I'll come to that in the second part of this broadcast, but to have real people on the ground working with real people assisting them is quite a nice, refreshing idea.
Yes, so one of the things that we have to remember when we talk about construction workers is that they're not usually very technical people. They prefer talking face to face with somebody who's there.
Yeah.
So it helps being close to them.
Yeah. And lastly, just for the audience, Ecano, who are Ecano? Why are you working with them? Who are they? What do they do?
They are a building company, and at this place where we are, they are building apartments. But they have many different projects. This is just one of them.
Okay. Good. All right. Well, we've come to the end of the first half of the show. We're going to have a little chat in the second half. Perhaps I could ask my colleague, Per Larssons, could you give us a few little observations here, Per, what you've heard so far and what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think that the interesting part is that we are still in a way of needing to recycle more. And that is a huge possibility when it comes to the construction sector. And what Linnéa talked about was the possibility to then support the construction when you're constructing a new building, because the builders really, they need to focusing on building the house. And we see that there is huge potential there. But then going further, and I think that Eli stressed that, the importance of rethink the total concept, how you produce new things. And I met, by the way, with one of the biggest real estate owners in Denmark, with several hundred billion of real estate value. And they wanted to build a zero emission house. And they wanted to really use recycled material or reused material in the building. And they succeeded. And I said, well, now we would like to have 10 more of those. And then the designer said, sorry, it's not possible. So we don't have this system up and running. We can't do it large scale. So we need to rethink how we do that and how we change the way how we produce raw material. Saint-Gobain has decided or had an interest to make sure that they reduce their CO2 emissions by, if they're going to continue to produce flat glass, they need to have another source. So I think it's impressive to see those big companies. I see the same with Tarkett. Tarkett is a flooring company. They have decided that they need to retake their carpets after 30 years of use. So things are happening, but it must go much, much faster. And I think the designers have a very important role to play here to make sure that the buildings are able to be dismantled so we can keep this high value. Like what you're doing, Linnéa, at Ecano, making sure that we can bring back the wood to new wood constructions and not being incinerated.
Okay, let's have a little chat about this because, again, we're skimming the surface, but we're sort of opening the doors and the windows to different kinds of ideas from what Nicholas was talking about to the other aspect of this, which is the recycling of materials. So like there's reuse of materials, but then there's recycling of materials. And so just to put it in two very broad areas. But let's talk about this because we know we need to move on. We know that if we don't act on this sector, that we're never going to achieve the Paris Climate Change Agreement, let's be honest, right? And that's really important because if you don't achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, then a lot of the things we love and care about in this world are not going to be looking quite as shiny as they were before we started building up greenhouse gases. So it's really important. The sector needs to do its job. Could you maybe articulate to me what you think is holding this back? If we've known about this issue for, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, maybe longer, maybe slightly less for some, but if we know that once as a society we did actually reuse things, what's going wrong? What's blocking us transforming this sector, understanding fully that it's a highly fragmented sector of many, 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 many players, right? So, Ditte, maybe I can come to you first. I mean, is there one thing that really keeps you awake at night or irritates you about this whole building, construction and design area that you think has been holding back, say in Europe, moving to higher levels of reuse and recycling and circularity?
Yeah, I think that there's two things I'll stress in that regard. One, on a more systemic level, that the built environment has to a very large degree moved into being a financial asset class, which means that you can question today if we built our buildings because we want to solve the problem of people having a home or an office, etc., or we are building primarily as a service to the financial sector, providing returns for a particular asset class. And it doesn't have to be either or. There's always been a combination and a collaboration between the built environment and financial services. But it might be that we need to bring back the balance of the financial sector being a service to the built environment, and remembering that the main purpose of the built environment is to build the buildings for people to live in and create value for a city, so that is what we measure our buildings based upon. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if implemented rightly, the taxonomy within the European Union can play a really important role there. The second part is there is sometimes the tendency to make it a bit of a zero-sum game in terms of solutions, that there's this sort of silver bullet, one-size-fits-all solution, when looking at the grandness of the challenge, both in terms of how big the problem is today, but also how much we need to build to put a roof over the head, running water, etc., for the growing middle class and global population. It really is that we need to include all of the different solution spaces. So within the circular economy, that being, we need to find smarter, better ways to create more value on fewer square meters, because for each of anyone of us to live in, because we are growing to the degree that we have. So finding ways to do that without compromising on value, and then reusing much more, so that all of the materials that can be reused should be reused, because it's the quickest way to stay within the planetary boundaries. And then once we've looked at that, also of course looking at recycling and replacing some of the materials that we have today. But we need to be mindful that all four needs to come into play if we are to have a chance of succeeding.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the idea of your opening bit about buildings have become a kind of financial asset thing, rather than thinking about actually what they're for, which is people, sort of thing. And I'm sure that we've often talked. I mean, Per will know this when we talked about plastics, right? We why don't we recycle more plastics? Why don't we do them with plastics? Well, there's also an old economy out there of certain people or companies that don't really want change, right? Because it's not in their business model. So, you know, the oil industry, for example, didn't really recycle that much plastic, to be honest, because they'd like to make more plastic. You know, that's what they do, because they have oil. And you see it in a lot of other areas, and we can see it with the car industry, right? Until Tesla came along, the car companies always were talking about, you know, electrifying transportation. It was only when Tesla was a success, they all went, okay, we have to do it, right? Or else we're going to lose market share. So it's very interesting, this idea of who wants circularity in the building and construction sector, and maybe those that don't, right? Because it's not in their business interest. But Camilla, I'm just going to turn to you, because one thing we've learned in the circular table talks is that often policy is really important, right? So you were mentioning that with flat glass and recycling flat glass into new flat glass, as it were, that there's something about contamination levels, and that you have to be very mindful of those. Is that a straitjacket? I mean, is that a policy regulation that could be, as it were, slow down the ability to reuse these materials? Do we need another debate within the EU on what contamination levels are in flat glass? I mean, you know, is policy making part of the answer to recycle these materials? I suppose that's the key question.
Yeah, we need to have a demand for recycled or reused material, of course, and to fulfill that, or well, in the best of worlds, the producers create the demand themselves, like Saint-Gobain, because they want to lower their own emissions from CO2. But in order to be able to use this recycled glass, it needs not to be contaminated, because then you'll get damaged glass out in the other end. So that doesn't really have to do with policy, because that's the sensitivity of their producing process, so to speak.
Yeah.
But there are not that many. Yeah. But there could also be some help if we have some kind of legislation or something that requires the involvement of recycled raw materials in new products. So the demand will increase, because if we don't have any demand, there won't be any change, of course. But it's also important when you produce products, they need to be produced so you will be able to reuse and recycle them again. So you don't just have one loop. You need to have several loops.
Exactly.
On the same product.
Nicholas, I want to ask you something. You mentioned taking 20-year-old glass and turning it into insulated windows and double glazing and even quadruple glazing, which was nice. Do you think that the increasing, we are going to be using more and more digital electrical equipment in buildings, right, to manage their carbon footprint and other things. Is that storing up another waste problem down the road that we haven't even thought about yet, and how we actually will dismantle buildings and reuse things? Does anybody ever? I was just thinking about that the other day, because buildings become like cars are becoming more full of electronics, right? Is that going to be a challenge for the future, or?
It's one of those things we've been working on for quite some years. Actually, is so again back to the understanding history. We have used a tool of mapping. Mapping is historically something we as a species have been doing for thousands of years, trying to understand what's beyond the next corner, and then drawing it up. We use the same methodology to actually to understand the buildings we enter, to understand the buildings that the client have a need to take down. And then before we even start talking about taking anything down, then we start to map out what is the potential in this structure? What is the potential economically? What is the potential of the resources, what they can be transformed into? And in this part, I really believe that technology is going to be the motor in it, the AI. So here in Lysgaard, we created a company called Lysgaard Up, which we then sold to become a separate company called Again. And I believe that in Again, they're set out to produce new products out of reused resources. So it's about finding an input material and then creating an output material. But in the heart of that, I think in the future, that's going to be some sort of a computer that can understand what is it we can put in and what is it we can take out of it. So I strongly believe that with computer, we can also measure our impact on CO2. And then it might come as no surprise, but I totally agree with Ditte on a lot of the things we talked about. Systematically, there's and fundamentally, there's a lot of things not working towards really having a circular built environment. If we take a very narrow focus in Denmark here, we have a refund system on bottles. You know, we drink water, we drink soda, and this system has become one of the most working closed loop systems in the world, simply by having a governmental strategy on putting on a refund pay on each buy you make, and then we have a collection system, and everything just makes it work. So we collect, I think it's the numbers are record high right now. It's like over 90% of all bottles sold are being recollected into this system.
Got you, Nicholas, yeah.
So we need to have something worked into the built environment that has the same carrot or the same benefit to when we build and when we map.
There needs to be incentives to recycle, reuse, and whatever they are, maybe economic incentives. You can either have carrots or sticks, can't you? You can either punish somebody for not doing it, or you can reward them for doing it. Sometimes in life you need both, right? But Ditte, I know you're coming in. I'll come back to you, but I think we've still got Linnéa here as well. I mean, does does something what Nicholas says ring true, Linnéa, a little bit with your area of work as well, which is that are there any really big incentives for companies that you're working with to actually recycle those materials? Or is it just that some are kind of more forward-looking than others, that basically they see that we have a world that will not survive with runaway climate change, that they need to reduce their emissions, so they do the right thing? Or are there others that need a little bit of a kick up the backside by government policy? Or does it require some kind of new incentives for, like, old concrete or something to be reused? What's your feeling about this?
A lot of the customers that we have, they have targets for recycling a certain amount of their waste, and they are very aware that the construction sector produces a lot of waste, and that they stand for a big part of the CO2 emissions in our society. But a lot of the time, this is targets that set themselves, but there are incentives to get qualified as an energy efficient building and such. There are limits to the minimum rate of recycling. So there are incentives for that. But when it comes to the other side, to actually buy recycled building material, that is, there's a lot more room for development and improvement there.
Right.
A lot of the time, the cost of the material is the deciding factor, and we are still in a society where the processes to create new products, they have been optimized over a long time, and creating new products out of recycled materials, that's still developing, and that is a problem. So there is perhaps a need for more incentives on that side.
Yeah. No, I think I get your point. Yeah. So on one side, it's not doing too badly, but on the other side, creating the demand for those recycled products is really important. This has come up again and again in the circular table talks with Ragn-Sells. Ditte, you were going to say something. You want to just jump in?
Yeah, it was just because I completely agree, but I think there's one thing that's important to be mindful of, and it goes a little bit back to Camilla's point on design of the products and why we need cross-industry collaboration, because the sad truth is that when we look at buildings and when Linnéa does the mappings, the buildings that have come up within the last 10, 20 years, the materials in those buildings are of a much lesser quality than of the buildings 50 years from now. So we've been innovating on the wrong things. They're composites, they're glued together, all these things. So it's actually becoming more difficult to recycle within these last couple of decades. So we need to fundamentally change that around, and that goes back to the producer. And we do see within other, like in plastics, for instance, part of that solution being introducing producer responsibilities. And I think in the built environment, that will also have to be part of how we solve it in the future, that we have not on the producers alone, but in collaboration between who handles the waste, who produces the materials, everything coming together so that we make sure that we have that true circularity from the get-go and through the entire lifetime. Because otherwise we might get some of the recycling rates up, but it will be at a low quality and thus difficult to create that demand for the future.
Right. And also storing up a potential time bomb in the developing world, where they're going to build most of the buildings in the future, take on all those kinds of materials that you're talking about, but creating another time bomb somewhere else, right? So this is a really urgent matter at this particular moment in time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really fast running out of time, and I want to turn to Eli. Eli, what are you going to do with this? It could be a little campaign, this, couldn't it? By We Don't Have Time and Ragn-Sells. We have these wonderful guests. We're going to have more wonderful guests on running up to the COP in the United Arab Emirates later in the year. That's the climate COP, of course. How are we going to push this forward? What is Ragn-Sells trying to achieve here? Are you going to bring other partners in? There's a whole ecosystem of interesting people that would be fascinated to join forces on this, to really start putting some pressure under the governments, not just the Danish and the Swedish and the Norwegians, but everybody?
Well, Nick, you like numbers, so you started with numbers. Let's end with some numbers. Here you go. Very frankly, 28 trillion euro investment is required across Europe to make us carbon neutral by 2050. Buildings is 30%. It's more than agriculture, it's more than industry, it's more than power, and even infrastructure. So the degrees of CO2 in construction sector has to go 3 times faster in the next 30 years compared with the past 30 years. Therefore, I think 3 principles to reach our ambitions is already set. We have global contribution, measurable goals, and benefiting nature and the people. And now we need to upgrade with another 3 principles. We need to have knowledge integration, broad engagement, and many types of activities. That's why Ragn-Sells is rolling in this spring a lot of roundtables. We have 3 in Sweden, 1 in Denmark, 1 in Norway, and 1 in Estonia. We are rolling actually at Ragn-Sells out the circular wheel by focusing on the construction sector, and we will try our best to have more in our basket and many more innovations inside before the end of November, where we can present at our planned construction seminar at COP28 in Dubai. Meanwhile, we are calling upon the champions in this sector at EU level, mainly in the Nordic, to synergy with us and other partners and stakeholders so we can all contribute effectively to a circular society. Nick, only together we can decrease this gap mentioned by Per at the beginning. Only together we can invent the future.
Yeah, good, Eli. And Per, come on, what's in your back pocket? You're with the International Chamber of Commerce now. They could be a good ally in this as well, couldn't they?
There we have all the companies represented. I totally agree with you. And coming back to this big real estate company that I talked with last week, and they really stressed the importance of having all stakeholders to start talking with each other. So exactly what Eli is saying on the roundtable, we will not collect just the construction companies. We will summon the whole value chain to understand the obstacles. Why don't we create these circular material flows? What is the challenge? And then also understand, are there any legal barriers that we need to overcome? So of course, we now like to have policymakers with us as well. And we will already before the COP28 also present our first findings at the Folkemötet in Bornholm. We will do that also at Almedalsveckan in Sweden. And then of course in Arendalsuken in Norway. So we will have the political dialogue. So if anyone here is watching the show that would like to contribute with your input, what is needed, we more than welcome you to come back to us, and we will include you in some of our different roundtables that we'll arrange. So I think it has been great to listen to you all, and the input is important, and we should have 10 or maybe 30 more people on this show, because there's so much different things you can do when you're constructing a new society. But we have just taken very small examples, but we see that there is room for improvement.
Yeah, I think as we go forward, I think we need to unpack the construction and what's happening, and then the demolition and what's happening, and what happens in those two sides of a very large story. And then I do think that what Nicholas is saying about this whole issue of how we remember that local, and it's for people and the locality, and how we reuse things, because sometimes these long supply chains, they're bad enough within a country, but across the globe, these are really huge challenges. And whether we can get back to a different way of thinking about our relationships with buildings, rather than just being something to build and something to destroy and then move on. So I haven't articulated myself very well there, but I think it's really important, this topic.
Yeah, and coming back to that, Nick, I would say that why are we sharing the knowledge at the COP28? We are not global yet. We will not be global for decades to come, or for maybe generations to come. But I think it's important to share knowledge. The more people that understand the possibilities, then we can make it happen. And it's our obligation to support a more sustainable world in the future.
Yeah, I think, thank you, guests, because I think, you know, a lot of people out there watching this will think nothing is happening. Clearly things are happening. People have absorbed a certain amount of knowledge on this, but the gap between where we need to be and where we are is still very large, and clearly, according to the UN Environment Programme, widening. So I hope we've left the audience with a sense that this is A, important, B, that there is some action going on, but there's a lot more to do, and I hope that they will tune into the upcoming broadcasts that we have on this. So again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Per very much as co-moderator. Thanks to Eli for helping to put this together. And yeah, hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.